Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is panel 2 of Indigenous Interventions, Reshaping Archives and Museums. We're really glad that you can join us today for panel 2, Contemporary Interventions from Indigenous Artists. I'm Kelly Weisskopf. I teach in the Department of English at Northwestern University, where I'm also an affiliate of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. I will introduce our panelists in the order that they'll be speaking, and then each person will give a presentation and we'll have a conversation after that. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce this lineup of artists to you today. Chris Papan is an American Indian artist of Kansa, Osage, Lakota, and European descent. A graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe and a nationally recognized painter, Chris's work is centered around the tradition of ledger art. He has works in major museum collections and exhibits his work at Santa Fe at Blue Rain Gallery. He resides in Chicago with his wife, Deborah Yepa Papan, and their daughter, Jihei. Our second speaker will be Frank Wan, who's a Lakota music artist from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, with a BA in Audio Arts and Acoustics from Columbia College, Chicago. Our third speaker is Andrea Carlson, who's Grand Portage Ojibwe and an artist currently based in Chicago. Aside from painting, her multimedia works have challenged ongoing settler placemaking. Next will be X, who's an Indigenous futurist and multidisciplinary artist specializing in land, architectural, and new media installation. He's an enrolled citizen of the Coushatta tribe of Louisiana, Coasati, and Indigenous Chamorro from the island of Guam, Hachamauri. X has exhibited and designed internationally, including the Museum of Contemporary Native Art, Venice Biennial, and Ars Electronica. He earned a Master of Architecture from the University of South Carolina and a Master of Fine Arts in Art and Technology from the School of Art Institute of Chicago. In 2021, X will debut his second earthwork, The Coiled Serpent, as well as an interactive 360 room at WNDR Museum, and unveil his redesigned intervention at the entrance of the Native American Hall at the Field Museum. Currently, his work, Ghost Touch, a gesture-controlled arcade game, is on display at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. Next up will be Teresa Montoya, who's Dene, and a Provost Postdoctoral Fellow and Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. Her research and media production focus on legacies of environmental contamination and settler colonialism in relationship to contemporary issues of tribal jurisdiction, regulatory politics, and public health in the Indigenous Southwest. Her photographic and film work has been shown and published internationally, most recently at an exhibition entitled Spill in Vancouver, British Columbia. In addition to her art practice, she has curatorial and education experience in various museum institutions, including the National Museum of the American Indian, the Peabody Essex Museum, the Indian Arts Research Center at the School for Advanced Research, and currently at the Field Museum, where she's working on the new reinstallation of the Native North American Hall. And finally, Deborah Yepa Papan, Jemez Pueblo, and Korean, explores the central dualities of her life using multimedia practice that combines digital collage and photography. While her earlier works examined issues of Native stereotypes, her works currently center on themes about her mixed race identity, cultural pride, and home by incorporating symbolic imagery influenced by both her cultures and the urban environment she was raised in. She's the community engagement coordinator for the Native American exhibition redevelopment at the Field Museum in her hometown, Chicago, where she advocates for inclusion of Native American voices and perspectives and provides support for the many artists collaborating in the redevelopment. With that, I'm excited to welcome Chris Papan as our first speaker. And I'm gonna stop sharing my slides so that he can share his.
Excellent, thank you so much, Kelly. Just bear with me one second while I share my screen. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to share this space with friends and relatives. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about my exhibit at the Field Museum. It was called Drawing on Tradition. And the slideshow will just serve as a quick kind of walk through the exhibition. When I was asked to do this exhibition, I was at first overwhelmed. But I realized the responsibility that I had and an opportunity to present our culture in a contemporary context through intervening. Initially, I wanted to include my work inside of the cases in order to be in conversation with those historic items. But due to the hazardous museum practices of the past, I could not do that. So what you see on the case there, these sort of decal labels became an alternative to including my work inside. In this way, I was able to directly confront viewers with contemporary visualizations of our existence and culture. The decal technique also mimicked my work and how these cases became a historical substrate, and adding my contemporary viewpoint directly on top of that, creating another layer of history. It was my observation that some people didn't really know how to cope with the cognitive dissonance between what they had always been taught about us of, total extermination or erasure, and then the fact that that there are living Indigenous people that are doing things right before their eyes. This is a specific piece that was inspired by the museum's collection, and I wanted it to be a piece that created space specifically for Native people in the museum, while also commenting on museum practices. In that old exhibit hall, they used to have many what I call everyday items on display, such as spoons and bowls. And the othering that was inherent in those displays made me wonder what the museum would collect from Native people today. So I thought it would be funny to see an old powwow chair or an old lawn chair in a display case. So this work not only challenges that idea, but at the same time, it becomes a recognizable icon for Native people visiting the museum and can immediately relate with it. And this part of the intervention, I wanted to try to give life back to the lifeless in this very dreary and drab, very kind of depressing exhibit hall, as it has been described. I've appropriated the Edward Muybridge running buffalo photographs in my other work. And so I thought this would be a great place to utilize that imagery. And what was interesting about this is that the bison was a gathering place for children that would go on docent tours in the exhibit hall. And so I wanted to give the kids a chance to, imagine this buffalo in its natural habitat and being alive and breathing. But unfortunately, I don't think the docents really spoke to anything of that intervention or any of the other works that were going on in the exhibit hall at that time. But I will say that the children that visited were the most receptive to the exhibition overall, or the intervention overall. This is an installation view showing the video installation that I will show you in the next slide. It's about 4 minutes long. So, and what I really liked about this is that it was two-sided, so it could be viewed from either end of the hall, and then that also mimicked a certain facet of my work of mirroring imagery. So I will now show you the video.
Recording.
So a couple quick notes about that video is that that the music, which was done by Santiago X, really resonated throughout the whole hall. So when people were kind of dealing with that cognitive dissonance that I was talking about earlier, folks were reminded of our contemporary existence through that music. And the photography done by Deborah Yepopopan and Adam Sings in the Timber. Some other work in this exhibition intervention referencing ledger work. This image is the model for the drawing was he was an Arapaho interpreter for the Field Museum whose name was Cleaver Warden, and came across his photograph in the archives, and the skulls represent the ancestors that continue to remain as property in the museum. I had mentioned about kids really connecting with the intervention exhibition overall, and this was like really a focal point for them. This pair of shoes that I had painted for another project. They were just, it was just such a great connection between contemporary culture and Native culture, and it was really great for the kids to be able to connect with that in a good way. And lastly, this is an image of the case that contained a teepee liner by the Kiowa artist Silverhorn, or Hagone. And I had been blatantly and severely mistreated by the museum when it was installed. Again, talking back to those hazardous and poor museum practices. But through the use of those decals, I was able to take some of Hagone's work that's in the museum collection and use that image of that he drew of the Kiowa people having a ceremony. So those people are now having a ceremony for this mistreated item in the museum. But I believe now that it's been deinstalled and has been restored, hopefully to a much better place. Also, I just want to say thank you to Alaka Wali for presenting us with that opportunity, and thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Frank Wan.
Takoyapi. Oyate trecha omani and machapelo. Hello, relatives. I introduced myself in Lakota. I said my Lakota name is Walks with the Young Nation or Walks with the New Nation. I also go by Frank Wan, and I'm a Sichungu Lakota music artist, multi-instrumentalist, storyteller from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. And I'm helping co-curate a music interactive space in the new Native American exhibition hall at the field. There will be like pods, I've been calling them rooms, but there'll be little pods, you know, with individual stories of people in community working with items and collections or activating them through our work, through our stories. So I arrived at that point. That was actually a culmination of an interesting history I have working with museums as a Native artist. So I'm going to talk about that a bit. I'm going to talk about some things I've observed and learned just working with several different types of museums. I've also been asked to keynote at the American Alliance of Museums conference a couple of years ago, and found a lot of success there. Some of the people at the field saw me speaking there before I joined on this project. So like I said, this project at the field for me is kind of like a culmination, and Alaka and some of the people at the museum know it's even goes further back than that till, you know, like my first year being here in Chicago, visiting the museum and doing an interview and just kind of, you know, expressing how the old hall made me feel. I did an interview and a video, and you know, years later, I never thought I would be helping change that space, or, you know, create something new and something beautiful that works for everybody. So I'm grateful for that opportunity, grateful for that journey. And like I said, I'm going to share some of the things I learned. And if there's time, I'll share a little bit of a song, because I'm a musician. I like to include music as much as I can. But one of the things that I've observed that's kind of interesting, and I think sometimes, you know, I've observed also, it's hard for maybe sometimes people in museums to see this, because it seems in my experience, museums are kind of like these silos, you know, and a lot goes on inside, but sometimes there isn't a lot of communication between those institutions. And so there could be something really awesome happening at some museum, and another museum is trying to do something similar, or, you know, could use some perspective, and sometimes that communication just doesn't happen. So I've had the privilege, like I said, of being able to work with museums, and what I'm going to speak on, the point I'm going to address, one of them, is kind of born out of that. So I'm a native hip hop artist. I'm a music performer. I perform music, but believe it or not, since I've been doing that professionally, paying my bills by performing and off my art for about, you know, 4 to 5 years. And in those 4 to 5 years, about 1/3 of my paid gigs have come from museums, which was a surprise to me. It wasn't something I pursued. It wasn't like I created work to be in museums or I wanted to perform in museums. Those opportunities just presented themselves to me as I created my work and put it out as a Native artist. And so as I started performing for museums and, you know, working with museums, I realized that I was getting booked at museums because in the United States, and actually in different parts of the world, because I've now performed in museums around the world, museums are one of the few places where you'll actually get to learn about Native people. And we know now a lot of that was colonial, and a lot of it, the information presented was presented in a wrong way and sometimes false information. But it was one of the few places where you as an American, or even other people around the world, you can go somewhere and learn about Native people. You don't really hear about us or our history in schools. There was a study done, like over 80% of US history books don't mention Indigenous people past the 1800s. You know, so I realized that a lot of institutions, especially in the United States, play into colonialism, and that they even sometimes subconsciously play into indigenous erasure and don't even include us in the conversation at all. But museums always had us in the conversation. And now, we were all on this call because we understand the history of that and how it was colonial and rooted in violence. But I try to look at, things, see if I can find a silver lining. And I realized as I was getting booked to perform in museums, to work with museums, the silver lining for me was that I had the ability to shape the narrative that I wanted to put out in those spaces, and people would come out and people would learn, and they would learn about, not only me, but my tribe and the history of the land they were on, the history of the country they live in. They would learn things that they never knew about their own country and about themselves. And again, museums have always been places for us to do that across the board. And the fact that Native people are presented in museums to me is, rooted in colonialism, but the silver lining to that, and the way I think we could take that and maybe use it as something to build on, is it's one of the few places and institutions in the United States anyway, and I've observed in other parts of the world, where you can actually go and learn about Native people now by Native people, because now we have a lot of Native people working in these institutions, and projects like the one we're working at the field are working towards this. So that point, museums are institutions, one of the few institutions in the United States for me as a Native artist, where you can go and learn about Native people directly from Native people now. And so for me, that's a point of hope and a point of moving forward. Another thing I wanted to mention, just to all the museum folks and even Native people, as we move forward in that, and I see changes, and our project at the field is an example of this, where these museums are now starting to work with Native communities, work with Native people. But I think the framework also needs to be changed in how they reciprocate that energy or compensate the Native people and communities, because, a lot of Native people, and I've had this in my own experience, where, I have knowledge about my tribe that I bring to the table that you aren't going to find in a master's degree. You aren't going to find in any sort of colonial education. And so it won't get valued as much as someone who has that education. But to me, there's elders back home that know more about, the Lakota things and collections than anyone I met with a master's degree. And so, that's another point to make, is just we need to imagine new ways and creative ways, I think, to meet Native people and Native communities in the middle with reciprocity. Because again, we're trying to not just extract, that was colonialism, we're trying to reciprocate, what can we give back. And lastly, as I finish up here, I'm gonna transition into a song. Actually, my music interactive room at the field will be centered around Native flutes, which is one of my ancestral instruments. I'm a music producer, I'm a multi-instrumentalist, and I'm going to play a song for you all that is an example of my final point I want to make, and that is that I encourage all the Native people and even the non-Native people listening, as we move forward in these museums, let's try to stray away from pan-Indianism and create tribally specific works. Like everything I do is rooted in Lakota thought process, and this song will be an example of that. The song is called Wopila, which is the Lakota word for thank you. We always created songs to give thanks, and this is a song I wrote to give thanks for someone who saved my life. And I mimic an eagle call with this because that's something my ancestors did, and I did that just as a songwriter. No one taught me that. And then I was talking to a Crow archaeologist, and he told me our ancestors used to mimic bird calls when we played instruments. And so I was doing that naturally. So I encourage all of us to just keep following our hearts, following our spirits. I mimic the eagle call on this, and also Lakotas would all usually acknowledge 7 directions when we would do things. So I do a certain call to the 7 directions to say thank you. So this is my thank you to all of you for tuning in too, and for all the organizers for asking me to be a part of this. Opila. Thank you all very much. I'm Frank Juan. I hope you all go check out the music interactive space. I help design at the field. We'll have a section where you can also record some music and send it to yourself. Thank you all. Peace.
Andrea Carlson is our next speaker.
Bonjour, Nandanoe Maveniduk, Andrea Carlson, Indigenous, Mikanak Nindo Dame, Chicago, Nindunjaba, Idash, Gitche Onigaming, Ishkonakan, Miigwich, Bizendawiyeg. My name is Andrea Carlson. I am Turtle Clan, Grand Portage Ojibwe, and I live in Chicago. So it's really hard to follow Frank, but I will try to pull you into the visual arts now. This I wanted to start with some of my early interventions into museums before I even had the vocabulary of museum interventions or even decolonization. Back in 2006. Artist Jim Denemy and myself, I had my first museum exhibition in 2007, and leading up to that, I had been studying objects and how objects carry stories, how we place stories onto objects and how those exchange hands, and sometimes we'll lose the story of an object and it becomes estranged. And so in this first museum show, I wanted to address the museum's actual collection within my art. And I used this metaphor of the museum being like a Wendigo. And Wendigos are a character within Ojibwe storytelling who misidentify who they consume. So they're the winter cannibal monster who emerge and are very hungry and they consume everything. But it takes that level of misidentification in order for them to commit acts of cannibalism. So I used that idea of the Wendigo and applied it to a museum that is hungry and it consumes and it consumes and it consumes, but often misunderstands what it's consuming and the humanity that lies within objects or various things it collects. So this piece is called Truthiness. It was painted in 2006. And at the center of it is a plate that's part of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts collection. The plate depicts a scene of Fort Snelling, which if you're familiar with Minnesota Native politics, Fort Snelling was like the Auschwitz for Dakota people in Minnesota. They were it was a prison for Dakota people before the Dakota people were exiled. This plate was made in Hamburg, Germany for export into the US in like 1864, just a couple of years after the Dakota uprising and the killing of the Dakota 38. So I imagine this piece in the collection as being highly significant, but has perhaps lost its significance on the people who have seen it. So I put it in the middle of my piece, kind of taking it out of the museum while it was in the museum and putting it into a false landscape. And the museum itself is a false landscape. So I did about 20 images for that exhibition that had various objects from the museum's collection. Let's see. Oh, next slide. I'm not in control. Sorry. Next slide, Kelly. Here's another piece from that exhibition. It has central to it. It has a French urn. And then I also was kind of thinking about these mythic landscapes, these landscapes that are storied with Ojibwe storytelling. So there's a device in Ojibwe storytelling that can pause a story, that can make the image static, and that's the ruffed grouse's asshole hangs aloft. So there's a ruffed grouse behind the urn, and there's many stories that contain Nanabuju, who's constantly playing with his identity. Next slide, please. So in keeping with just my museum interventions with one particular museum, this is the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. Back in 2016, I was commissioned to do a film. This is called Let, an act of an act of reverse incorporation, where I imagined a grand procession coming out of the museum and into the yard out front, where replicas of the museum's collections objects are buried. So this is part of that film. I used green screen techniques in order to kind of project the actual objects onto the fake objects that I made. So this is the procession out of the museum into the yard. Next slide. This is everyone crossing the street, and you can kind of see how things are green screened onto the objects. Next slide. Then, as part of that film, we had an assistant record each, we referred to them as stakeholders, but all of the collaborators on the project, which there initially was around 20, to rewrite wall labels throughout the museum. This wall label is written by Gregory Rose. It's the first time and he's an African-American artist based in Minneapolis. And it was the first time Black Lives Matter was in the African collection, like those words were in printed in the African collection. In this poetry, he talks about having this power figure from the Congo being stolen from Africa, brought to the US, and then put on display behind plexiglass as though it is a captive within itself. But this power figure is supposed to protect the community. And so what does that mean for something to have been stolen and brought over here and then put on display behind glass? So he wrote this poem and then read it, and all of the contributors read their wall didactics, and then that became the soundtrack for the film. Next slide, please. So then in 2017, I was asked to curate just a display case at MIA. This is at the beginning. I had not seen Chris Papan's work at that point, but what I had done was asked all of my Ojibwe poetry writing friends to contribute poetry for the display case that was then vinyled onto the display case glass. And then within the display case are various birch bark forms, various scrolls, and things that, originally that's how we recorded things, was on birch bark. So this is Denise Lachmadeer's poem, Birch Bark Biting. She's a terrific birch bark biter, and her birch bark bitten works are in the display case. Next slide, please. This is Dark Sky Reserve by Hyde Erdrich. And the display case was so long that it could actually accommodate her poetry. Next slide, please. And there's one of the poems is by Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, who is widely considered the first Native poet. Of course, Natives have music and have been, poets from time immemorial. But Jane Johnston Schoolcraft is I don't know how, but is considered the first Native poet. And so I have her Ojibwe. The poem that I included is about her kids being taken from her to go to boarding school in the East. Behind this poem in the display case, there's a piece by Amu Angiacom, who actually died 2 days before this opened, which was very hard, and it kind of made a different commentary on this display case, because his piece is about 7 grandfathers and the journey after you die. So that's all the slides I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Next up is X.
Hafaday, Chicano, Itimalaka, Amayiksa, Fitu. My name is X. I'm a citizen of the Kusati Nation of Louisiana and indigenous to the Hachamari people of Guam. I greeted myself in both languages. Was given my clan by my mother, my grandmother, great-grandmother. Both of my cultures are matriarchal. So that's something I celebrate in my work, and that's something that I try to reinforce as a father of 2 Indigenous daughters, how we received our clan of the turkey. And, you know, I'm an Indigenous futurist. I'm an architect. I'm a new media artist. I do all these things as, you know, as basically as you know, outlets, expressions, gestures, a response to the call, the necessity for Indigenous people to speak up and intervene and to amplify the narrative that's missing from this landscape, you know, after colonialism, ongoing colonialism for most of us. So my work, and I didn't expect to, you know, arrive at being an activist or even an artist for that matter. My entire trajectory started as an architect, wanting to design beautiful buildings, right? That's how it started. But as soon as I started jumping into academia and learning more about the built environment, the more, you know, the problems came up, the more the corner conditions arrived for Indigenous people. And I look at the city and not see, you know, our aesthetic, our ways of placemaking, our principles reflected in the landscape. So that's something that, for me, is my ethos. You know, it's starting fires in all of these institutions, museums, whatever you want to call them. That's my approach. So I'll start with some work. Actually, coming straight, I moved here from LA about 8 years ago. And prior to coming here, you know, I wasn't inundated with the problems of things like mascots, Indigenous mascots. So it was new for me coming here. But you know, as I was, you know, learning and adapting to a new place, Chicago, you know, and experiencing what it is to be Native here. I arrived at a time that was, you know, the American Indian Center was sponsored by the Chicago Blackhawks. And there were founding members of this youth council that I really respect, Cheyenne Nation's Youth Council, knocking down the doors to make way for visibility for Indigenous people and the correction of these distortions. So it was at that time I was pretty inspired by these moves in the community. And it inspired this work, Native Mascot Disposal, years later, where I would, you know, take over these institutions, these galleries, universities, and lay out these jerseys, you know, as a participatory installation to promote some solidarity. You know, as each person put this racist paraphernalia inside the trash can, they would have some sort of empowerment. You know, that manifested into a work called Burial Mound. Inside, this is at the UIC, you know, just like a mile down from the United Center, where these collected jerseys became this manifestation, representation of the conical mound, so we can put them to rest and hopefully resurrect the importance of the Sauk people. We had a Meskwaki song in the back, healing song looping as this pile of jerseys was burning. You know, when it comes to recent interventions, you know, I have been trying to reinvigorate ancestral placemaking. Like I said, you know, I looked at the landscape. I didn't see the Indigenous architecture and ways of placemaking reflected, right? So, and upon my own reflection of my own ancestry and my own people, you know, I realized that we had abandoned the practice of earthwork, creation, mountain civilizations, you know, soon after we encountered Hernando de Soto, and lots of other tribes east of the Mississippi River specifically abandoned those practices as well. And there's been a reinvigoration, a low-key reinvigoration by the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, creating platform mounds. And before I knew that, I wanted to, start my own journey to the creation of these mounds. So here in Chicago, we created Octochinto, the Serpent Twin Mound, to usurp these notions of erasure through the creation of colonial architecture, colonial city grids. This entire city, to me, is for the most part, is a monument to white supremacy in the creation of this architecture. Mounds were erased to create the L lines, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to reinvigorate this and create works that usurp that idea of placemaking. I was invited to the Chicago Architecture Biennial to contribute. Prior to that, I did an installation, a collaboration with Chi Nations Youth Council on this work called Sovereign, where essentially, if you look at the built environment and you extrapolate, some sort of pixelization, this works as kind of a glitch in that colonial framework where you can walk inside this space and, experience, a moment of sanctity, a moment of rearranging, all this residual oppression and creating something beautiful. Those grasses were collected by me and Chi Nations, and this is a non-native grass that suffocates the land and restricts indigenous mediation and indigenous landscape from thriving. I took this and I brought it to the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and I set it on fire. Like I said, I'm all about setting fires in these institutions, and this was one modality of that, where I took that, I put it on top of a platform earthen mound, and I set it on fire. I'll show you some different angles. Here's some footage of that. So yeah, I mean, it's, these institutions, as much as in history, indigenous people have been made to kind of perform, for these institutions. I think in 2020, it's our opportunity, and it's our call as indigenous artists, curators, to intervene in these institutions and make them perform for us. So with that said, there's been this movement to topple monuments to white supremacy, monuments to indigenous distortion throughout the city of Chicago and nationally. And that's, very much the people from the bottom up tearing these down and creating an awareness, creating a call for institutions to examine themselves, for cities, towns, states, governments, the world, to look into the mirror and recognize who is being oppressed and who's being empowered. So this is a glimpse of a new video game that I've created, and it will be unveiled at the MCA shortly. But what I did is I created a game where you can do some cathartic removal of these monuments for yourself using gesture-based controls. You're surrounded by this monumental white supremacist architecture, and I'm not softening who I'm identifying. I'm a graduate of the Art Institute of Chicago. Their building is there. I'm displayed in the MCA. Their building is there. The White House is there. Mount Rushmore. It's a call. It's a call. As indigenous people in these institutions, we're being called to set these fires and to hold up a mirror to these institutions. And that's exactly what we need to do going forward. No matter what it takes, no matter how painful it is, we need to paint this portrait for the potential for beauty, to prosper, and for better understanding and better truth giving through these institutions. And I'm thankful for the opportunity.
Thank you, X. Our next speaker is Teresa Montoya.
Hello, everyone. Okay. Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, everyone, for bringing together this wonderful group of Indigenous scholars and activists and artists. I would just like to begin with an introduction in my Dene language. Yate she Teresa Montoya yenishe tatmezani mishle. Biligane bashish chin ado ashinhe dashite naka dashinele. This is just the way that we orient ourselves to each other in relation. I'm Navajo on my mother's side, and I am Mexican American on my father's side. I'm going to share my screen now. I have a little presentation. And in beginning in this way, by orienting myself to my other Indigenous relatives, I also want to call into relation the water. And these are photos for where I'm from, where my family's from on the Navajo Nation. This is where I began my research in 2015 through 16. So being trained as an anthropologist, we undertake field work, and my research centers on issues of environmental contamination on and around Indigenous lands, and specifically in the communities where my family is from. So this community here, Sanders, which is known as Klachit as Ahe, is right along the I-40 interstate. Right here in the foreground is the Puerco River, and there's a fracking plant in the background. The Navajo Nation, like many other nations in the Indigenous Southwest, is riddled with the legacy of uranium mining from the Cold War era. There's over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation. The worst nuclear spill in US history was the Church Rock spill of 1979. So the communities that I work with are facing the ongoing impacts of that spill over 30 years later, being downstream to that toxic disaster. And I just want to show this image. This is taken from an environmental scholar, Tommy Rock. This is showing, this is the dominant way of understanding environmental toxicity from a scientific perspective. He's a Navajo researcher, and he used the tools of Western science to bring this knowledge back to the community. This is a different way that we can understand contamination through this visualization of this toxic sludge from the 2015 Gold King mine spill that once again, even though it took place off the current geopolitical boundaries of the nation, it flowed right through the dominant farming communities through Dene Bikea. So in showing these images, I just want to foreground some of my larger research questions, and how, as an educator, how can I translate this into a mode that people can understand, not only for our own Dene communities, but for students of all backgrounds. Because I think, the language of science is often obtuse, and it's difficult for people to comprehend. And so in trying to visualize what is toxicity is an attempt for me to put some of my own research questions into a different sort of medium. This image right here, taken in Shiprock, shows like the confluence of these concerns around environmental toxicity in Dene communities with this sign written in Navajo language, warning people about moving beyond this fence, which is a former uranium mill tailing site that spilled in the 1960s into the San Juan River, the very same river of the Gold King mine spill. Across the Navajo Nation, you see water tanks that are decorated with art to warn people against drinking from these unregulated water sources. And over 50% of Navajo households do not have running water. And this is a concern that's been heightened in the COVID era. So this brings me to my project called Tolkletso, Yellow Water. And, I was originally, I had the ambition of becoming a photojournalist when I was in high school. And, I've always documented the world around me. And now that I'm an environmental researcher and an anthropologist and, working in Native studies, the opportunity to bring some of these initial impulses of documentation and photojournalism with my research has converged around this project. So this photo essay was published in 2016. It's a collection of 25 photos following a road trip that I took with my collaborator, Angela Baca, who's also a Dene Hopi filmmaker. We started at the discharge point near Gold King Mine in Silverton, Colorado, and I followed the path of this spill. I wanted to highlight these differential relationships to toxicity. Silverton is a small town in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. The entire town is designated a National Historic Landmark, which just heightens this, this settler fascination with gold mining and also of these now dilapidated infrastructures that literally can be found all along the mountain range. This image here, I think, kind of encapsulates that idea of settler nostalgia for Western expansion. And icons like this are found all over the region. As we move downstream, this is Durango. And it's ironic that this sign here, no dumping, is along the Animas River. And you can see in the background, there's people who are supping or paddleboarding on the river. So this is also indexing a sort of recreational relationship that these non-Indigenous communities have with the river. River rafting. And finally, you cross the border into the Navajo Nation. This is in Shiprock. And this was during a food sovereignty conference in 2016. And this was after a full night of steaming the corn in an underground earthen oven. And kind of putting these two sorts of images in relationship with one another, you can see the different sorts of relationships that these communities have with water itself and the differential impacts that they have faced because of this toxic spill. So for several growing seasons following the Gold King mine spill, these Dene communities had stopped growing food. This had tremendous impacts not only on their sustenance and for many farmers who relied on this for economic support, but also for our ceremonies and the ability for Indigenous folks to practice their ceremonies that rely on the cultivation and harvest of corn. But yet, despite the endurance of this toxic contamination, communities have continued to come together. This was during a Gold King mine spill resilience walk one year after the spill, and we walked 9 miles from Hogback to Shiprock to the river banks of the San Juan River, which is a sacred river to Navajo communities. It's a male entity, and we put down offerings and prayers. So despite all of these, constant onslaughts, I wanted to, prioritize and privilege not only the sovereignty and self-determination of these communities, but their attempts to keep growing corn and finding ways to use the tools of Western science, through community water sampling projects and Sanders, for instance, a radiation monitoring project, like all these ways that they have strategically used that knowledge to better understand how they can continue to enact food sovereignty. This is just another image from that walk, with messages, water is life. This was also around the same time that Standing Rock was taking off, and those mobilizations against No DAPL. This image here, I attended a number of community listening sessions. This is, Navajo EPA and Navajo hydrologist researchers, as I said, use tools of Western science to notify and educate the community about water contamination. So this isn't just to say that these two sorts of knowledges exist in tension and they can't be brought together, but I think the power is for Indigenous researchers to use that to their benefit, to educate our people, because how can we be sovereign if we can't even grow our own food in clean soil and water? So lastly, this is the framing question that I asked in this exhibit that I was invited to participate in last year at the Belkin Gallery at the University of British Columbia. So sampling is a common practice as part of routine water quality assessment or in the aftermath of a toxic spill. It is a way to document and also to bear witness. So following the Gold King mine spill, in addition to taking footage, collecting audio samples, I also collected water samples. So I went back to the same places where I filmed years before with my collaborator, and I to the best of my ability as a non-hydrologist, I collected these. I had a cooler, I put them on ice, and then I drove directly to Albuquerque, where I had a contact in the chemistry department at the University of New Mexico. So I had these analyzed, and I wanted to put this on display in the exhibit alongside the 25 photographs to index, once again, those differential ways of understanding water, of relating to water, and to understanding the contamination of water. So this is just a photo from that exhibit display. The visitor here is listening to those audio samples that I spliced, which correspond to each of these bottles here on display. Yeah, and here we go. This is, just to kind of throw into stark relief this obfuscation of science and how do we understand water, and even the how it's just reduced to these numbers and variables. These were the main contaminants that Dene researchers had looked at in their environmental health assessment study. So I also selected these same contaminants, and I put them on display for visitors to see. And I want to invite people, to think more critically about, these dominant forms of representing water. I think it's important for us to understand what's in our water as we drink it, but also to understand that there's other ways of relating to and understanding water, but beyond these scientific discourses. And that's really the questions that I want to provoke with this project. And in my, my pedagogy and different presentations that I've done, I invite people, to think alongside me, and to prioritize these other ways that Indigenous peoples, are continuing to fight and understand these forms of extraction, which, as I said, I think, citizen science is one way that communities are doing that, but it's maybe not often highlighted as much in media narratives, which tend to verge on I guess what you call poverty porn. So I think me showing the example of other Indigenous researchers, and I give a nod to Dr. Carletta Chief, who was the hydrologist that conducted this Navajo Gold King exposure project, environmental scientist Tommy Rock. And I'm happy if during our discussion to provide some more information about those projects. So in summary, I'll just say that, my art practice is really about bringing together, my impulse to educate and to understand environmental contamination in my own research, and to privilege, the art and resiliency of our communities. I take photos every day, not always with my DSLR, but, with my cell phone. I've got, 39,000 images on there. So yeah, I've always been a photographer, and this is a way that I can, continue to help educate about the assaults on our homelands. And I will leave it there right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Our final speaker will be Deborah Yepa-Papan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Wow, just what an amazing lineup. I'll try to go really quickly here, but I'm just going to share a little bit of my my art. So my art comes from it comes from a personal place when I create. You know, I'm creating images of my personal identity as a mixed race Native Asian person. And also, I hit on themes about home, the importance of home, and that, for many Native people, we have multiple homes. It's, our ancestral homelands and maybe the places that we live. And for myself, it's here in Chicago. And also my role as a mother, and being very proud of, my daughter, and, my daughter who is somebody who has chosen to, carry on traditional ways and participates in ceremony. So that's this first image here, there and back again. Sasine Pazun Indian is, challenging stereotypes of what Native people look like. And in that way of challenging those stereotypes, I'm also challenging, just kind of the legacy of museums and how museums have been guilty in helping to perpetuate those kinds of imagery for people in, having collected and amassed such a huge collection of plains, material culture and putting that on display, thus, helping to create that, that's the only kind of Native person that exists. And so, especially here in the Midwest, that's the image, the preconception that people have of who Native people are. So I'm challenging that. Next slide, please. And so again, these are just, more pieces of my daughter. Again, just, creating work that is for Native people, creating work that Native people, and particularly Pueblo people, can identify with, especially with these pieces, as my daughter is in her regalia. And so, for me, anytime that we create, we're intervening. Anytime we show our artwork in spaces that, were not created for us, so, art museums or colonial institutions, non-Native spaces, whenever we show in those places, we are intervening. Anytime we share our stories, our narratives, anything that comes from our voice, we are intervening. Anytime that we bring Native people into those spaces to see our work, we are intervening. Next slide, please. So here's an intervention, I guess, in a way. This piece, and I'm proud to show alongside my husband, Chris Papan, and Santiago X, at the MCA, Museum of Contemporary Art. We're in a large group show of local Native artists called The Long Dream. We three are the first contemporary Native artists to show at the MCA. It's a long time coming. We had this opportunity. We didn't charge in. I wish we could have charged in. That would have been very gratifying if we charged in with our work. But this is one of those ways that we're intervening. We're bringing our voices in, and I'm gonna, as much as can be allowed right now during, the pandemic. I'm going to send tons of Native people to go into the MCA to see our work. And, I think part of that, intervention there is also demanding, that they purchase, they acquire, they acquisition Native artwork to be in this museum. We belong in these places, which brings the question to me, like, do we belong in these places? Yes, we do. But I think the question should be asked, do museums belong here? They're on Native land. Do they belong here? So next slide, please. So my intervention, I guess, my physical intervention into museum happened at the Field Museum. And it, largely thanks to Chris's exhibition, which, kind of gave me that opportunity to volunteer my time and invite Native people to come into the museum and have space, like and be there, have a presence in this institution as a way of, reminding people that like we are in here. We have a right to be here. Next slide, please. So as an artist and having a long art career, I've been able to build and expand on my own personal network of artists from, just around other Native artists from around the country. And so what I try to do, next slide, please, is open those doors for other Native people, other Native artists to come into this space and intervene in ways, in their own ways. So here's an example of, Santiago doing some projections during one of the Members Night events at the Field Museum. Next slide. And then they hired me to officially fill the role of community engagement coordinator. So here's my office, and I feel like I like to say that my office is also an intervention in the museum in, how I have Native art all over the place and, reminding people that they are on Indigenous land. Next slide. And again, going back to, making the space accessible and available to Native people, to other Native artists to use, to utilize, and to make their own space, to bring in their own agency, to share, their narratives. And I think I have one more slide, which is just another example of how Native people have been able to use the space at the Field Museum. I think as an artist, it's really important for us to support each other and to help provide opportunities to each other. And this is the way that I feel like, I can help other artists create their own interventions, use the museum for their benefit and not the other way around. It's not, Native artists coming into the museum for the museum's benefit. It's we're coming in there to use the space, to utilize the space to create a different space, to have presence for our benefit. And I think I do have one more slide. And that includes guerrilla style interventions, like Emily Johnson, who's a Yupik movement artist, performing artist. She's a dancer. She's Yupik, and what she's doing here is she's erasing the E word. The E word being Eskimo. And, I think it was just such an important intervention to help facilitate, because the E word had been something that was just so harmful, especially for Emily when she first saw that word, and to see it all over in the museum. It was really important, or in this exhibition hall, it was really important for her to erase that word from this space. And so it was just such an important act and statement. And, I would love to see more, guerrilla style interventions happen in other museums as well. Sometimes we just have to find those cracks to get in and start tearing down and dismantling from the inside out. So that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I think I was falling down on my duties as curator of slides because I was trying to write so frantically as you all were speaking. We have just a little bit of time left, but there's one question that's to all of you. So if you all don't mind turning back on your videos, we can hopefully have a conversation that speaks to each of you. And just to first say thank you all so much for sharing your work with us and speaking about your work as artists and the interventions you make. Deborah, I really appreciated your point. Anytime we create, we're intervening. which I feel like is a thread that kind of cuts across all of the talks. And the question you pose, do museums belong here? Which I hope is a question we can take from the entire symposium. Okay, so I'll just ask this question, and then I would love to hear responses from each of you. So this is from one of our attendees who asks, you mentioned the colonial nature of academia, and this person writes, as an Indigenous person, how can someone like me, Anishinabekwe from the citizen band Potawatomi, work from within these colonial institutions like museums or universities to reclaim and decolonize these spaces and discourses, all while protecting our joy and our heart while doing so?
I think, you know, I think the biggest benefit of being an Indigenous person in these spaces is learning the problems, exposing the problems of these institutions, you know, using, learning these tools that these people are willing to give you, and turning them into weapons against the distortions, weapons against colonialism, and, you know, learning your own methodologies for how to turn those cracks in the foundation, you know, these faulty foundations, into, you know, collapsing these infrastructures. So it's a long process, and we're all a part of this battle. And I think, you know, use those degrees against them. You know, use every single tool and turn it into a weapon.
I'll just add on, I agree with what X said, you know, take like I said, try to find the silver lining, you know, see if you can take what they gave us and flip it on them. And oftentimes you can. But I'll also say on that tip of like keeping your joy and keeping your heart intact, it's tough. It's a tough world. But I think for me, one of the things that keeps me going is knowing that this work needs to happen, and I might not see the end goal I want to see in my lifetime, but we have to do this work now so the next generations can do it. And I think that's another Indigenous way of looking at it, is looking at it generationally instead of just like, what am I going to get out of this? You know, because sometimes you might not see the result you want, or sometimes too, also I've seen results I never expected and seen beautiful things that I never expected to happen. And so, you know, just know that it's generational work, and we are all doing generational work.
Yeah, and
Add on to that, if I could say really quickly, one thing I've been asking myself is where does the pain end and where does the beauty begin? That's something I ask continually when we're doing this work.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I'm not going to lie, it's exhausting. It's mentally, emotionally exhausting to be in these places, and especially when we're one or two or three or four in a large institution. It's tough, but you know, you have to, you need a strong support system. And I think that's what really helps. That's what helps me. It helps to have a very strong grounding. You know, I'm lucky that I have, you know, my family that supports me through all of this. You know, I have a good circle of friends that, you know, I can turn to, that, you know, that support. So really just having like some sort of support system is so helpful in this, and finding those accomplices and allies within the institution that are not native to have your back and hear you, and speak up for you when you're not there, or speak on, you know, help you along on that journey. But it is tough, I'm not going to lie.
I would also add that, you know, probably a long time ago, you know, people would think that it would be important for you to assimilate into that kind of structure in order to bring it down from within. But it's becoming more apparent that you don't have to assimilate into that culture of the colonial institution, that you can remain true to yourself. And you know, like Lauren said, use those tools that they gave you to bring it down, but you don't have to assimilate. You can stay true to yourself.
Yeah, I would like to echo some of what Deborah was saying, and you know, that's true. And I think for not only museum institutions, but all institutions of higher education, you know, that we are in spaces that, you know, are inherently colonial from their founding, their funding, and often we are some of the few people who are native in these spaces. So, you know, creating those solidarities across institutions, like I've been very fortunate since I came here to Chicago, you know, there's a lot of people doing good work, you know, at the Field Museum, at the Newberry, at Northwestern, UIC, American Indian Center. So being able to find that community here in Chicago has been really helpful for me as someone who's not from the Midwest region, and also, you know, honoring the Indigenous people who are actually from here. And so I guess one thing that I will say to these institutions is, you know, even though we kind of use this homogenous term of Indigenous, we are not homogenous in terms of our own distinct communities, our own distinct, you know, political alliances. So I think a lot of times institutions, when they're first starting this work of like, oh, how do we bring in Indigenous people? It just becomes a way to fill in a slot, you know, and the hard work is for us to find that nuanced sort of relationship between us. And so I think that's kind of the next challenge, is to hold institutions, you know, accountable to learning the specific histories of the land that they are built upon. You know, I'm Dene, but I'm not from Chicago. So I'm also, you know, schooling myself and trying to understand, you know, the specific history of this place. And that's something that we all have to do, you know, whether we're Indigenous or not.
Yeah, I'd like to echo on that, it's within our capabilities as Indigenous people to displace each other. And I try to be very aware of that. Also, I am in this really incredibly privileged position where I engage with museums and institutions on a very temporary transactional basis, and I don't actually get a paycheck from a museum. That's not my livelihood. It's related to my career, but it's not. So I sometimes come in with a lot of criticism for museums, but I also understand that the people that work within them that are Indigenous are harmed on a daily basis, and so I often, you know, consider that when I do throw stones at museums. I'll also say, when I was in grad school, one of my professors, who was very aware of my criticisms of museums and my interest in museum studies, that she told me that, you know, you're biting the hand that feeds. Watch out. We will be punished and disciplined for calling out museums. And I at the time I didn't believe it, and then over the course of my career, it's just like maybe she was right. I wanted to fight everything at that moment, but I'm starting to really kind of approach museums differently as well, because I know that they're trying to protect something, and I want at that thing they're trying to protect. So yeah, we're often at odds.
Maybe building on that, I'm going to see if I can combine two questions. We're having some great questions come in. We're also a little over time, so I'm going to see if I can combine two just to keep the conversation going, but also give people a little bit of a break. So there's a question that asks what ideas you would suggest for guerrilla interventions. So speaking a little bit to Andrea's point about museums wanting to protect something, but also kind of wanting at that thing. Would love to hear you think about like ways of intervening in ways that might be not quite visible, or might go along kind of unexpected routes. And then in relation to that, there's a question about the ways that archives and museums can facilitate connections between Indigenous artists. And one of the things I was thinking about as you all were speaking was the ways that your collaborations and friendships with other artists were really coming through in your work. So Chris, the ways that Adam Sings in the Timber and X's work was in your exhibition, Andrea Hyde-Erdrich's and Denise Lajidamodier's work is in your, thank you, in your piece at the MIA. And I know this comes up for other folks as well. So I'd love to hear you all think a little bit about collaboration, whether you see that as being facilitated or happening in an archive and museum, or whether that actually happens outside but maybe seeps into some of those interventions. So maybe feel free to take up either or both questions, and we'll hear from each panelist and then take our lunch break.
I'll start. I think sometimes it's just they're unplanned. And they do sometimes grow out of the relationships that we have with each other, artist to artist or, friend to friend. And then it starts with conversation and then it builds from that. And then, you just kind of, these opportunities just kind of, make themselves available and you just have to pounce on that. Other times, it could be something different. It could be just literally a charging in and, and doing something. But I really think that, there's a difference between when you're dismantling or trying to bring down institutions. There's a difference between being on the outside and throwing bricks at the building and actually trying to, being on the inside and trying to tear it down that way. They're both different tactics, but, sometimes they have to happen at the same time too. But really, I think too, a lot of it is just, it's a lot of things happen organically also, just from my own personal experience.
I'll piggyback off Deb and just try to touch on both points quickly and say, for me, and I think Deb spoke on this, and same as Andrea said, I have the privilege of kind of being in a not a steady relationship with museums where it's like my 9 to 5 and I'm in there every week, but where, I go in and drop out. And so that's also a privilege, being a Native person, being able to work with museums in that sort of capacity. And I do see, my Native relatives who work in these institutions carry a different burden than those of us who don't work in these institutions. And so, I try to recognize that, but also, help each other through that. Like Deb said, it's our support system that helps her navigate all that. And I think a lot of the work we're doing as Native people is community based, it's community oriented, it's community made. So, that sense of community will come with us in our work and in our collaborations. And you see it, on this panel, a lot of us consider each other family, even on this panel. And so it's just, I think it's just rooted in indigeneity, these collaborations and how they come about. Like Deb said, it happens organically because we're coming from community. And for guerrilla intervention ideas, I would just suggest, focusing on your gifts and, your tools and like what your lane is and what you're good at. And then, trying to find a way to maybe intervene in that way. And like Deb said, sometimes you just got to wait for the right moment. Sometimes some of my best moments of intervention just happen quickly and out of nowhere, and sometimes it was years of planning to lead up to an intervention. So I think just be open and fluid to the process.
I have a fantasy guerrilla intervention that, so there's this beautiful bit of landscape and it's just kind of open lot of land behind MCA. Give that back to Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. All of these institutions between Michigan Avenue and the lake, there's so many of them. There's the Field Museum, there's MCA, there's the Art Institute. Chicago tells its story on unceded Potawatomi land. There are no reservations in Illinois. These institutions could take all of their yards and properties around their space, give them back to the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, just land back. That's your earth drawing. That's your, that's your contemporary art. Just seed it all. And that would include like, why doesn't the Newberry or or Northwestern? Why not take all of the property around your institutions and that your institutions are on and give it back? That's my desire. I don't know if Pokagon Band is on board, but I would love to see that. I would love to see that would be radical presence within the city, and it would just be absolutely stunning and gorgeous to see happen.
Yeah, I think, yes. Give it all back, please. ASAP. But I know that it's a slow journey. It's a slow process. It takes bricks on the outside, like Deborah said. It takes fires on the inside. It's a multi-tiered, war, to end this pain and restore the beauty that we as Indigenous people see. We can see through these buildings. We can see through this city. We can see the truth embedded in the land you know, embedded in our elders, embedded in ourselves. We can see that, and we want to show it to everyone. You know, so our interventions in these museums is a practice in trying to reveal, you know, the things that we see, and we're trying to show people, you know, how beautiful it can be, how painful it is at the same time. But you know, we want the pain to end, you know, collectively. Like, and the collaborations, they come up very organically. This is a work that showcases Andrea Carlson in her language, acknowledging, you know, who the true people are of this land, and it's meant to be iterative. It's meant to be one perspective, one voice. But like, this is an example of a guerrilla style film that was commissioned by an institution here. But, you know, I don't tell them everything. I don't tell them all the facts and all the, you know, what I'm going to do until it's done. So that's one tactic that I have when I'm working with institutions is you know, there's a level of Trojan horseness that we have to activate, you know, in our work. And you have to tell them, though, you know, we're going to be telling the truth. We want you to be a part of this discourse along the way. Here's the general idea, and it becomes something beautiful. You know, this is probably one of the best works I ever made. And I'm not a filmmaker, right? But I'm writing a love letter to the land and paying homage to the people that need to be acknowledged. The Potawatomi, you know, and all the ancestors that could still be here but aren't, you know, and the land remembers. So like, this is called acknowledgement. So that's one whole thing we haven't even talked about, is this trend of acknowledgement. You know, what are we acknowledging collectively? Who's acknowledging us? You know, that's my question. Who's acknowledging us? Are these institutions acknowledging us, or what? Are they seeing through us like we see through them?
Yeah, I don't think I can add to any of the other points that have been so eloquently put forward by my fellow panelists. The only thing I can think of to say in response to all that is I was reminded of the words of Douglas Miles, who's the creator of Apache skateboards, when he said in one of his posts on Instagram or Facebook that I decolonize every room I enter. And that speaks to what Deborah said also about, you know, how we intervene anytime we go anywhere. You know, that's our intervention. So you know, and that's a guerrilla tactic, is, you know, putting your body in a space that wasn't meant for you, but is built on your land. Get in there and just, you know, put your body in there to begin with. And yeah, and as far as collaboration is concerned, I feel it's just a natural thing that happens. You know, we don't have to really think about it. It happens. So thank you.
Teresa, do you want to add anything before we break?
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you to all of you for your amazing presentations, your interventions. You know, I've worked in museum spaces before, and I'm also now, you know, collaborating, but not, and I'm not a full-time employee of the Field Museum. But I think some of the interventions that can be made, you know, as, you know, the Field being a natural history museum, you know, when I was working on this exhibit, I didn't want to put most of the historic things on display because I did not know their provenance. I did not know if these things were gathered in a funerary context, and that made me deeply uncomfortable. So, you know, even though I'm working just on 2 cases, I'm working with 4 artists. And for them who, with COVID, have had some of their opportunities to go to art markets cut short, I felt like it was at least my small intervention is to, like, okay, get the Field Museum to acquire some of their art, because this is helping support them. And also it's bringing in these necessary perspectives into the museum space. And furthermore, kind of behind the scenes, things that aren't even going to be on display is the creation of these videos to document each of those creations that are being made. And before it even goes to the museum, giving them the opportunity to edit whatever story that they are told or they're telling. Because once these things enter the museum space, then it becomes an object. It becomes something that is the property of the museum. So I think some of these interventions is, prioritizing the authority that, our Indigenous relatives have over their own stories. And that means not just in the display collaborations, but the collaborations with the accession of objects. And there's all these things that I think the public doesn't see. And I think that's actually where a lot of the real work is that can be done for museums, even if it's giving the land back, a physical space for communities. So yeah, I'm deeply moved by what everyone has said today. Thank you.
Thank you all for your work and for sharing your work with us today. We're so grateful and for the conversation.